Section 61 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks, Journal from 25 August, 1768 to 12 July, 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail, Timmerman, Vaughan. Section 61. Some account of the Cape of Good Hope. Notwithstanding, hydrographers limit the Cape of Good Hope to a single point of land on the southwest end of Africa, which is not the southward part of that immense continent. I shall, under that name, speak of the southern parts of Africa in general, as far as latitude 30 at least, which country was originally inhabited by the Hottentots alone, but is now settled by the Dutch, and from its conveniency of situation as a place of refreshment for ships sailing to and from India, is visited perhaps by Europeans oftener than any other distant part of the globe. This tract of land, vast as it is settled by the Dutch, who have also people much farther inland, if their counts can be credited. They have upon the whole of it, however, only one town, which is generally known by the name of Cape Town. It is situated on the Atlantic side, about 20 miles to the northward of the real Cape, on the banks of a bay, sheltered from the southeast wind by a large mountain, level at the top, from whence both itself and the bay have got the name of Tafel or Table. It is of late years very much increased in size, and consists of about 1,000 houses, neatly built of brick and in general whitened over. The streets in general are broad and commodious, all crossing each other at right angles. In the chief of them is a canal, on each side of which is a row of oak trees, which flourish tolerably well and yield an agreeable shade to walkers. Besides this, there is another canal running through the town, but the slope of the ground is so great that both are obliged to be furnished with sluices at the intervals of little more than 50 yards. In the houses, the same poverty of inventions exists here as at Batavia. They are almost universally built upon one and the same plan, whether small or large. In general they are low, and universally they are covered with thatch, precautions said to be necessary against the violence of the southeast winds, which at some seasons of the year come down from the Table Mountain with incredible violence. Of the inhabitants, a far larger proportion are real Dutch than of those of Batavia. But as the whole town in a manner is supported by entertaining and supplying strangers, each man in some degree imitates the manners and customs of the nation with which he is chiefly concerned. The ladies, however, do not follow their husbands in this particular, but so true are they to the customs of fatherland that scarce one of them will stir without a souterkind or chauffette ready to place under her feet whenever she shall set down. The younger ones, though, in general, do not put any fire in them, but seem to use them merely for show. In general, they are handsome, with clear skins and high complexions, and when married, no reflections upon my countrywomen, are the best housekeepers imaginable, and great child-bearers. Had I been inclined for a wife, I think this is the place of all others I have seen where I could have best suited myself. Their servants are in general Malay slaves, who are brought here from Batavia. To these they behave much better than the Batavians, in consequence of which these Malays are much quieter, honester, more diligent, and less wicked than those in that place, in instance of which I need only say that there was never known an instance of running amok in this place. The town is governed by a governor and council, who are quite independent of Batavia. The present governor is Rick Topok. He is very old and has long enjoyed his present station with a most universal good character, which is easily explained in this manner. He is unmarried and has no connections, which may make him wish to make more money than his salary furnishes him with. Consequently, not entering into trade, he interferes with no man, and not wishing to be bribed, does always, to the best of his abilities, strict justice on all occasions. The climate, though not at all too hot for those who come from India, would doubtless appear sufficiently warm, could anyone be transported immediately from England to this place. Upon the whole, it seems much of the same temperature as the island of Madeira, though scarce quite so hot. This I judge from the productions in general. During the whole summer the air is frequently fanned by southeast winds, which come off the hills above the town with vast violence, and during the time of their blowing, especially at the beginning, are very troublesome to such as are obliged to be abroad in them, by raising the sand with which the whole country abounds, and filling their eyes with it. Nor are the houses quite free from its effects, however close they are shut up. The sand will find an entrance, and in a short time cover every kind of furniture with a thick dust. Inconvenient as this certainly is, it however does not seem to have any effect beyond the present moment, though the inhabitants must in the course of a summer inspire an immense quantity of this sand, which has been thought by some physicians to be productive of ulcers in the lungs, etc., etc. Yet consumptions are diseases scarcely known here, and the healthy countenances, fresh complexions, and above all the number of children, with which all ranks of people here are blessed, abundantly prove that the climate in general is very friendly to the human constitution. Diseases brought here from Europe are said to be almost immediately cured, but those of the Indies not so easily, which latter we ourselves experienced. Our sick recovering very little for the first fortnight, and after that very slowly, so that after a month's stay several of them were far from recruited. The industry of the Dutch, so well known and so constantly exerted in all foreign settlements, has supplied this place with a profusion of all kinds of European provisions. Wheat and barley is here as good as in Europe. Hops, however, will not grow here, so beer they cannot make even tolerable. Cattle are in great plenty, and beef very tolerable. Sheep likewise in great plenty. Both these the native Hottentots had before the Dutch settled the place, so they both differ a little in appearance from those of other places. The oxen are lighter and more neatly made, and have vast spreading horns. The sheep, instead of wool, are covered with a kind of substance between hair and wool. Their tails are also very large. I have seen such as could not weigh less than 10 or 12 pounds, and was told that they are often much larger. Of the milk of their cows they make very good butter, but cheese they know not how to make in any degree of perfection. Besides these they have goats in plenty, which however they never eat, and hogs, but these are less plentiful. Poultry, as fowls, ducks, geese, etc., are in tolerable plenty. Besides they have wild game, as hares, exactly like ours in Europe, partridges of 2 kinds, quails, antelopes of many kinds, bustards in general very well flavored, but rather drier than those of the same kinds in Europe. As their fields produce European wheat and barley, so their gardens produce the same kinds of vegetables as we have in Europe. Cabbages, turnips, potatoes, asparagus, broccoli, etc., etc., are all plentiful and excellent in their kinds. Their fruits are also the same, apples, pears, oranges, peaches, apricots, and figs, etc. Of Indian fruits they have plantains, guavas, and jambu, but neither of these in any kind of perfection. Besides these, their vineyards produce a great quantity of wine, which they range into many sorts, calling one Madeira, another Frontenac, etc. None of these are comparable to the wines which we commonly drink in Europe, yet they are all light, well cured, and far from unpalatable in taste, not unlike some of the light French and Portuguese white wines. The famous Constantia, so well known in Europe, is made genuine only at one vineyard, which is about 10 miles distant from the Cape Town. Near that, however, is another vineyard, which likewise is called Constantia, where a wine not much inferior to it is made, which is always to be had at an inferior price. The common method of living is to lodge and board with some one of the inhabitants, many of whose houses are always open for the reception of strangers. The prices are 5, 4, 3, or 2 shillings a day, for which all necessaries are found you, according as your situation leads you to choose a more or less expensive method of living, in what may truly be called a profusion in proportion to the price you give. Besides this, there is hardly an expense in the place. Coaches are seldom or never used, but may be hired at the rate of 6 rix, or 11b4s, a day. Horses are at 6s a day, but the country is not tempting enough to induce anyone often to make use of them. Public entertainments there are none, nor were there any private ones owing to the measles, which broke out about the time of our arrival. At other times I was told that there were, and that strangers were always welcome to them, if of any rank. At the farther end of the High Street is the Company's Garden, which is near 2/3 of an English mile in length. The whole is divided by walks, intersecting each other at right angles, planted with oaks, which are clipped into wall hedges, except in the centre walk, where they are suffered to grow to their size. This walk, therefore, at all times of the day, furnishes an agreeable shade, no doubt highly beneficial to the sick, as the country is not furnished with the least degree of shade, nor has nature given one tree to the soil capable of producing it, at least within several miles round the town. Infinitely The largest part of this garden is employed in producing cabbages, carrots, etc. 2 small squares, however, are set apart for botanical plants, which are well taken care of and neatly kept. At the time we were there, the greatest part of the plants, as the annuals, bulbs, etc., were under the ground. Upon the whole, however, I am of opinion that the numbers now to be found there will not amount to above half of what they were when Oldenland wrote his catalogue. Indeed, at this time it is possible that more ground was employed for the purpose. At the farther end of the garden is a vivarium or menagerie, supported also at the expense of the company, where rare beasts and birds are kept. Here were ostriches, cassowaries, antelopes of several kinds, zebras, and several other animals seldom or never seen in Europe, particularly that called by the Hottentots coidoi, whose beautiful spiral horns are often brought over to Europe. This animal, who was as large as a horse, died while we were there, but not before I had had time to get a description and drawing of him. Near this enclosure is another for birds, in which were the crowned pigeons of Banda, and several more rare birds, especially of the duck kind, of which were indeed a very fine collection. Both birds and beasts were very carefully and well taken care of. It remains now, after having described the town and its environs, to say a little of the country about it. Of this, indeed, I can say but little, and even for that little am obliged to depend entirely upon hearsay, not having had an opportunity of making even one excursion, owing in great measure to Dr. Solander's illness. The Dutch say that they have settled the country inland as far as 2,200 miles. At least, so far it is to the most distant habitations of Europeans. How far it may be, however, upon a straight line north and south, is hard to say, nor do they pretend to guess. Supposing it, however, the shortest distance possible, it is sufficient to prove the infinite and, indeed, to an European almost inconceivable barrenness of the country in general, that the mere supplies of food should make it necessary for men to spread themselves over such an immense tract of country, in order to find fertile spots capable of producing it. How far distant such spots are from each other may be concluded from what one farmer told us while there, on being asked why he brought his young children with him to the Cape, from whence he lived 15 days' journey, and told me that he had better have left them with his next neighbour. "Neighbour?" said he, "my nearest neighbour lives 5 days' journey from me." Nor does the country immediately in the neighbourhood of the Cape give any reason to contradict the idea of immense barrenness, which must be formed from what I have said. The country in general is either bare rock, shifting sand, or grounds covered with heath, etc., like the moors of Derbyshire, Yorkshire, etc., except the very banks of the few rivulets, where are a few plantations chiefly employed, if well sheltered, in raising garden stuff, and if rather less so, in vineyards. But if exposed, nothing can stand the violence of the winds which blow here through the whole summer or dry season. During my whole stay here, I did not see a tree in its native soil so tall as myself. Indeed, housekeepers complain of the dearness of firewood as almost equal to that of provisions, nothing being burnt here but roots, which must be dug out of the ground. What indeed proves the influence of the wind in prejudice to vegetation is that a stem not thicker than my thumb will have a root as thick as my arm or leg, and thicker they never are. As their distant settlements are directly inland, and the whole coast either is or is thought to be totally destitute of harbours, their whole communication is carried on by land carriage. Wagons drawn by oxen are employed in that service. They are, however, very light, and the cattle so much more nimble than ours in Europe, that they assured us that they sometimes travelled at the rate of 8 miles an hour. Travelling is also very cheap, as there are no inns upon the road. Everyone must carry his own provision with him, and the oxen must live upon the heath or ling which they meet with upon the road, and indeed they are accustomed to do. But great as these conveniences are, the people who come from afar must do little more than live, as there is no trade here but for a few articles of provision which are sent to the East Indies, and curiosities. So they can bring nothing to market but a little butter, such skins of wild beasts as they have been able to procure, and some of them a few kinds of drugs. There remains nothing now but to say a word or two concerning the Hottentots, so frequently spoken of by travellers, by whom they are generally represented as the outcast of the human species, a race whose intellectual faculties are so little superior to those of beasts, that some have been inclined to suppose them more nearly related to baboons than men. Notwithstanding, I very much desired it. I was not able to see any of their habitations, there being none, as I was universally informed, within less than 4 days' journey from the Cape, in which they retained their original customs. Those who come to the Cape, which are in number and not a few, are the servants of the Dutch farmers, whose cattle they take care of, and generally run before their wagons. These, no doubt, are the lowest and meanest of them, and those alone I can describe. These were in general slim in make, and rather lean than at all plump or fat, in size equal to Europeans, some as tall as 6 feet and more. Their eyes not expressive of any liveliness, but rather dull and unmeaning. The colour of their skins nearest to that of soot, owing in great measure to the dirt, which by long use was ingrained into it, for I believe that they never wash themselves. Their hair curled in very fine rings, like that of Negroes or of Persian lambskin, but hanging in falling ringlets, 7 or 8 inches long. Their clothes consisted of a skin, generally of a sheep, under which for decency's sake the men wore a small pouch, and the women a broad leather flap fastened round their waists by a belt, which in both sexes was richly ornamented with beads and small pieces of copper. Besides this, both sexes wore necklaces and sometimes bracelets, likewise of beads. And the women had round their legs certain rings made of leather, very hard, which they said served to defend them from the thorns with which the country everywhere abounds. Under their feet some wore a kind of sandal of wood or bark, but the greatest number went entirely unshod. For bodily qualifications they were strong and appeared nimble and active in a high degree. Their language, which appears to an European, but indistinctly articulated, has this remarkable singularity, in that, in the pronouncing a sentence, they click or cluck with their tongues at very frequent intervals, so much so that these clicks do not seem to have any particular meaning, except possibly to divide words or certain combinations of words. How this can be effected unless they can click with their tongues, without inspiring their breath, appears mysterious to a European, and yet I am told that many of the Dutch farmers understand and speak their language very fluently. Almost all of them, however, speak Dutch, which they do without clicking their tongues, or any peculiarity whatsoever. In general, they have more false shame, mauvais honte, than any people I have seen, which I have often had occasion to experience, when I have with the greatest difficulty persuaded them to dance or even to speak to each other in their own language in my presence. Their songs and dances are in extremes, some tolerably active, consisting of brisk music and quick motions, generally consisting of distortions of the body with unnatural leaps, crossing the legs backward and forward, etc., and then again as dull and spiritless as can be imagined, one of which consists entirely of beating the earth first with one foot and then with the other, without moving their place at all, to the cadences of a tune furnished with little more variety than the dance. Smoking is a custom most generally used among them, in doing which they do not, as the European, admit the smoke no farther than their mouths, but like the Chinese, suck it into their lungs, where they keep it for near a minute before they expire it. They commonly mix with their tobacco the leaves of hemp, which they cultivate for that purpose, or Phlomis leonuris, which they call dacha. Their food is the same as that of the farmers, chiefly bread and coarse cheese, but they are immensely fond of spirituous liquors, and will never fail to get drunk with them if they have an opportunity. This little and no more of the customs of this much spoke of people had I an opportunity of seeing. From the Dutch indeed I heard much, of which I select the following. Within the boundaries of the Dutch settlements are many different nations of Hottentots, differing from each other in customs very materially. Of these some are far superior to others in arts in general. However, all live peaceably with each other, seldom fighting, except those who live to the eastward, who are much infested with people called by the Dutch Bushmen, who live entirely upon plunder, stealing the cattle of the Hottentots, but never openly attacking them. They are armed, however, with lances or assegais, arrows, which they know how to poison, some with the juice of herbs, other with the poison of the snake, called cobra de capello, and stones, which some particular tribes know so well how to throw that they will repeatedly strike a dollar or crown piece at the distance of 100 paces. Besides this, they train up bulls, which they constantly place round their kraals or towns. In the night these will constantly assemble, and oppose either man or beast that approaches them, nor will they desist till they hear the voices of their masters, who know how either to encourage them to fight, or in an instant make them as tame and tractable as their other cattle. Some nations know how to melt and prepare copper, which is found among them probably native, and make of it wrought plates, with which they ornament their foreheads. Others again, indeed most, know how to harden bits of iron, which they procure from the Dutch, and make of them knives of a temper superior to any the Dutch can sell them. Their chief people, many of whom have a large quantity of cattle of their own, are generally clad in the skins of lions, tigers, or zebras, etc., which they know how to fringe and ornament very prettily, especially the women, who, as in all other countries, are fond of dress. Both sexes grease themselves very frequently, but never use any stinking grease if they can possibly get either fresh mutton suet or sweet butter, which last, made by shaking the milk in a bag made of skin, is generally used by the richer sort. The ceremony of the priest giving his matrimonial benediction by a plentiful sprinkling of urine, often repeated, I heard confirmed. The Dutch, however, universally denied their having seen women whose legs were wrapped round with sheep's guts, which it has been supposed were to be a part of their food. Their monorchides, or semi-castration, was in general totally denied. Some, however, said that among the nation who knew how to melt copper were some who had undergone this ceremony, and that these were their best warriors, and the individual people who so well knew how to throw stones. In regard to the sinus pudoris, that grand query of natural historians, many whom I asked, both Dutch and Malays, declared positively that it did not at all exist, and several of these assured me that they had, during intrigues with Hottentot women, had an opportunity of knowing which they had made use of. One, however, declared that something he had met with, but what it was he could not tell. And above all, a physician of the place declared that he had cured many hundred Hottentot women of venereal complaints, and that he never saw one without what he described to be fleshy, or rather skinny, appendages proceeding from the upper part of the labia, in appearance somewhat like cow's teats, but flat, which hung pendulous. These were very various in lengths, in some scarce half an inch, in others 3 or 4. That those, which were the only particularities he knew of in those women, he apprehended to be what authors called sinus pudoris, though some have described it as a large skin equal to a garment for all purposes of decency, and others have thought it to be no more than an elongation of the clitoris in those women, which does not exist in those women at all more remarkable than in Europeans. A table of the value of money, supposing a stiver Dutch equal to a penny sterling, a guinea 18 shillings, half a dough 9 shillings, a crown piece 4 shillings, half of dough 2 shillings, a shilling 10 Dutch stivers, a French crown 4 shillings 6 Dutch stivers, a ducat 9 shillings, a ducatoon 6 shillings, a skilling 6 Dutch stivers, a double-chee 2 Dutch stivers, a stiver 1 Dutch stiver, an imperial riksdaler 4 shillings, Albert's dough 6 shillings, Dane's riksdaler 4 shillings, Spanish dollar 4 shillings 6 riksdalers, 6 Dutch stivers, a quarter of a dough 1 shilling. End of section 61. Some account of the Cape of Good Hope. Section 62 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail, Timmerman, Vaughan. Section 62. May 1771. 1771, May 1. In the morn, at daybreak, saw the island of St. Helena, about 6 leagues ahead. Consequently, before noon, arrived in the road where we found His Majesty's ship Portland, Captain Elliot, sent out to convoy home the Indiamen on account of the likelihood of a breach with Spain. Also, His Majesty's sloop Swallow, which had the day before brought word of the pacific measures adopted by that court. Also 12 sail of Indiamen. 1771, May 2. As the fleet was to sail immediately and our ship to accompany it, it became necessary to make as much of a short time as possible, so this whole day was employed in riding about the island, in the course of which we made very nearly the complete circuit of it, visiting all the most remarkable places that we had been told of. 1771, May 3. Spent this day in botanizing on the ridge where the cabbage trees grow, visiting Cuckold's Point and Diana's Peak, the highest land in the island, as settled by the observation of Mr. Maskelyne, who was sent out to this island by the Royal Society for the purpose of observing the transit of Venus in the year 1761. See account of St. Helena below. 1771 May 4. Depart St. Helena for England. Sailed after dinner in company with 12 Indiamen and His Majesty's ship Portland. Resolved to steer homewards, with all expedition in order if possible, to bring home the first news of our voyage, as we found that many particulars of it has transpired, and particularly that a copy of the latitudes and longitudes of most or all the principal places we had been at had been taken by the captain's clerk from the captain's own journal and given or sold to one of the India captains. War we had no longer the least suspicion of, the Indiamen being ordered to sail immediately without waiting for the few who were not yet arrived, was a sufficient proof that our friends at home were not at all apprehensive of it. 1771 May 6. Pleasant breeze, but our ship very far astern. She certainly sails worse than any one of the fleet, yet as she keeps up with them, at least in sight, hope they will not get home much before us. 1771 May 7. Still kept company, and today were abreast of the headmost ship. Many flying fish were seen, and some few birds. 1771 May 10. This day we saw the island of Ascension, which is tolerably high land. Our captain, however, did not choose to anchor, unwilling to give the fleet so much start of him. Those who have been ashore upon this island say it is little more than a heap of cinders, the remains of a volcano which burnt even since the discovery of the Indies. Osbeck, who was ashore upon it, found only 5 species of plants, but I am much inclined to believe that there are others which escaped his notice, as he certainly was not on the side of the island where the French land, in which place, I have been informed, is a pretty wide plain, covered with herbage, among which grows Cactus opuntia, a plant not seen by that gentleman. 1771 May 11. Pleasant weather. Saw Holothuria physalis, which our seamen call Portuguese man-of-war, for the first time since we left these seas in going out. 1771 May 12. Rainy, misty weather, the air very damp and unwholesome. The breeze, however, continues. 1771 May 12. Our trade begins now to slacken very much. A man-of-war bird was seen. 1771 May 16. Caught a small shark. 1771 May 17. Struck one bonito, weighing near 20 pounds. 1771 May 18. Our trade wind gone today, the winds variable and very light. 1771 May 19. Squally with frequent calms, such weather as ships never fail to meet with in passing from one trade wind to the other. To make the most, however, of this disagreeable weather, we went on board the Portland and spent the day with Captain Elliot. 1771 May 23. Calms still continued. Dined on board the Portland with Captain Elliot. While on board her, saw a common house martin flying about the ship. 1771 May 26. Heavy rain and frequent squalls from the northeast gave us great reason to expect the trade very quickly. During the day we were very much ahead of the fleet. At night, however, they came up with us fast. 1771 May 27. In the night the wind settled at northeast, and in the morn, to our great surprise, we had no sight of the fleet, even from our mastheads, so were obliged to jog on by ourselves. A bird, something like again, but darker, was seen about the ship, which settled upon the water, and remained there till out of sight. 1771 May 29. Fresh trade, which quickly relieved everybody from the depression of spirits, etc., which is the constant companion of the damp calms we have now passed through. 1771 May 30. Trade very fresh indeed, with a heavy sea, so that the ship pitched and tumbled very disagreeably to us, whom a continuance of fine weather has made almost unfit for a gale. End of section 62. May 1771. Section 63 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail, Timmerman, Vaughan. Section 63. Some account of St. Helena. This small island, which is no more than 12 miles long and 7 broad, is situated in a manner in the middle of the vast Atlantic Ocean, being 400 leagues distant from the coast of Africa, and above 600 from that of America. It appears to be, or rather is, the summit of some eminence mountain, which, towering far above the level of the earth, in this part of the globe very much depressed, elevates itself even considerably above the surface of the sea, which covers its highest neighbours with a body of water even to this time unfathomable to the researches of mankind. The higher parts of all countries have been observed almost without exception to be the seats of volcanoes, while the lower parts are much seldomer found to be so. Etna and Vesuvius have no land higher than themselves in their neighbourhood. Hekla is the highest hill in Iceland, and in the highest part of the Andes in South America volcanoes are frequent, and the Pike of Teneriffe still is on fire. These still continue to burn, but numberless others have been found to show evident marks of fires now extinct, and which have been so from the times of our earliest traditions. That this has been the case with St. Helena, and that the great inequalities of the ground there have been originally caused by the sinking of the ground, easily appears to an observing eye who compares the opposite ridges, which, though separated always by deep and sometimes by tolerably broad valleys, have such a perfect similarity in appearance, as well as direction, as scarce leaves room for a doubt that they formerly made a part of a much less uneven surface, and that this sinking in of the earth has been occasioned by subterraneous fires. The stones abundantly testify, as they universally show marks of having been, some time or other, exposed to the effects of a great degree of heat. Some are evidently burnt almost to a cinder, especially those which are found near the bottoms of valleys, as may be seen in going up Side Path, and probably Ladder Hill also. Others show small bubbles, as is seen in glass, which has been urged almost to fusion. Again others, which perhaps from their situation on the tops of ridges have been exposed to a far less degree of heat, or from their own apyrous qualities, show scarce any signs of having been in fire. Yet in many of these, if carefully examined, are found small pieces of extraneous bodies, such as mundics, etc., which have submitted to the fires, though it was not able to make any alteration in the appearance of the stone which contained them. Thus much for these suggestions, fit only for those who can believe a Babylonian chronology. I pass now to the present state of the island, a subject which would afford much entertainment to a contemplative mind, and more food to an inquisitive one than the shortness of my stay gave me opportunity to collect. Making it as we did, and indeed most ships do, on the windward side, it is a rude heap of rocks, bounded by precipices of an amazing height, composed of a kind of half-friable rocks, which however show not the least sign of vegetation, nor does a nearer view appear more promising. In sailing along the shore, ships come uncommonly near to it, so that the huge cliffs seem almost to overhang and threaten destruction by the apparent probability of their giving way. In this manner they sail till they open Chapel Valley, where stands the small town. Even that valley resembles a large trench, in the bottom of which a few plants are to be seen, but its sides are as bare as the cliff next the sea. Such is the apparent barrenness of the island in its present cultivated state. Nor do you see any signs of fertility till you have penetrated beyond the first hills. Then the valleys begin to be green, and though everywhere inconceivably steep, produce a great deal of good herbage. Among these are the planters' houses, near each of which is a small plantation of cocoas, the only vegetable they seem to labour much in the cultivation of. The town stands just by the seaside, very small, and except a few houses ill built. The church, which originally has been a very poor building, is now almost in ruins, and the market house is advancing by quick steps to the same situation. The white inhabitants are almost to a man English, who, as they are not allowed to have any trade or commerce of their own, live entirely by supplying such ships as touch the place with refreshments, of which, however, to their shame be it spoken, they appear to have by no means a supply equal to the extent as well as fertility of their soil, as well as the fortunate situation of their island seem to promise. Situate in a degree between temperate and warm, their soil might produce most, if not all, the vegetables of Europe, together with the fruits of the Indies. Yet both are almost totally neglected. Cabbages, indeed, and garden stuff in general is very good, but so far from being in plenty, so as to supply the ships who touch here, a scanty allowance only of them are to be got, chiefly by favour from the greater people, who totally monopolize every article produced by the island, excepting only beef and mutton, which the company keep in their own hands. And though there is a market house in the town, yet nothing is sold publicly, nor could either of the 3 kings' ships that were there get greens for their tables, except only Captain Elliot, the commanding officer, who was furnished by order of the governor out of his own garden. Here are plantains, peaches, lemons, apples, guavas, and I believe scarce any other fruits, though probably very few kinds exist in either Indies which might not be cultivated here or brought at least to a great degree of perfection. But while their pastures lay, as they really do, as much neglected as their gardens, there can be little hopes of amendment. In short, the custom of the India's captains, who always make very handsome presents to the families where they are entertained, besides paying any extravagant prizes for the few refreshments they get, seem to have inspired the people with a degree of laziness. Were refreshments cheap, they would probably, upon the whole, receive not much more money for them by the year, and the present would be the same, so at least they seem to think. In short, the Cape of Good Hope, which though by nature a mere desert, supplies abundant refreshments of all kinds to ships of all nations who touch there, contrasted with this island, which though highly favoured by nature, shows not aptly the geniuses of the 2 nations in making colonies. Nor do I think I go too far in asserting that was the Cape now in the hands of the English, it would be a desert, as St. Helena, in the hands of the Dutch, would as infallibly become a paradise. Small as this island is, and not raised very much above the surface of the sea, it enjoys a variety of climates hardly to be believed. The cabbage trees, as they are called, which grow on the highest ridges, can by no art be cultivated on the lower ones, where the redwood and gumwood grow, both which in their turns refuse the high ridges, and neither of the 3 are to be found in the valleys, which indeed are in general covered with European plants, or the more common ones of the Indies, in all probability originally brought here by ships, and the more so as much the largest proportion of them are natives of England, among which I may reckon the meadow grass, Anthoxanthum odoratum, which is the chief covering of their pastures, and to which I am much inclined to attribute the verdure of the island, which far exceeds anything I have before seen in equally low latitudes. The firs also, Ulex europaeus, the seeds of which were brought over in the beginning of this century, thrives wonderfully, and is highly praised by the islanders as a great improvement, though they make no use of it except heating their ovens. Barley has been sown upon this island about 40 years ago. It produced sufficient to supply itself, without any being sent from home. Its cultivation was, however, suddenly dropped, for what reason I could not find out, and since that time has never been attempted. Yams, the same as are called cocoas in the West Indies, is what they chiefly depend upon to supply their numerous slaves with provision. These, however, are not cultivated in half the perfection that I have seen in the South Sea Islands, nor have they, like the Indians, several sorts, many of which are very palatable, but are confined to only one, and that one of the worst. All kinds of labour is here performed by man. Indeed, he is the only animal that works, except a few saddle horses, nor has he the least assistance of art to enable him to perform his task. Supposing the roads to be too steep and narrow for carts, an objection which lies against only one part of the island, yet the simple contrivance of wheelbarrows would doubtless be far preferable to carrying burthens upon the head, and even that expedient was never tried. Their slaves indeed are very numerous. They have them from most parts of the world, but they appear to me a miserable race, worn out almost with the severity of the punishments of which they frequently complained. I am sorry to say that it appeared to me that far more frequent and more wanton cruelty were exercised by my countrymen over these unfortunate people than even their neighbours the Dutch, famed for inhumanity, are guilty of. One rule, however, they strictly observe, which is never to punish when ships are there. Nature has blessed this island with very few productions, either useful for the support or conducive to the luxury of mankind. Partridges and doves are the only animals, except possibly rats and mice, much more probably brought here by ships. Among vegetables, purslane, celery, watercresses, wild mint, and tobacco, though now common among the rocks, I doubt much whether they were so before people came here, as none except the last are found in the parallel latitudes. The first, indeed, is found on Ascension, and many parts equally likely to have originally produced it, but that is accounted for by the ancient custom of the Portuguese, who, finding this herb particularly beneficial in complaints contracted in long voyages, made a point of sowing it wherever they went ashore, a custom from whence all nations have since reaped no small benefit. Amongst its native products, however, ebony must be reckoned, though the trees that produce it are now nearly extinct, and no one remembers the time when they were at all plentiful. Yet pieces of the wood are frequently found in the valleys, of a fine black colour, and a hardness almost equal to iron. These, however, are almost always so short and so crooked that no use has yet been made of them. Whether the tree is the same as that which produces ebony on the Isle of Bourbon and its adjacent islands is impossible to know, as the French have not yet published any account of it. Other species of trees and plants, which seem to have been originally natives of the island, are few in number. Insects there are also a few, and one species of snails, who inhabit only the tops of the highest ridges, and probably have been there ever since their original creation. Had our stay upon the island been longer, we should, in all probability, have discovered some more natural productions, but in all likelihood not many. Secluded as this rock is from the rest of the world by seas of immense extent, it is difficult to imagine how anything not originally created in that spot could by any accident arrive at it. For my part, I confess I feel more wonder in the finding a little snail on the top of the ridges of St. Helena than in finding people upon America or any other part of the globe. As the benefits of the land are so limited, the sea must often be applied to by the natives of this little rock, nor is she unmindful of their necessities, which she constantly supplies with immense plenty, and no less variety of fish. She indeed would be culpable did she do otherwise. She never met with a calamity equal to that of the earth in the general deluge, and her sons have moreover an advantage of a free intercourse with all parts of the globe habitable to them, without being driven to the necessity of tempting the dangers of an element unsuited to their natures, a fatal necessity under which too many even of us lords of creation yearly perish. And of all others through the wide bounds of creation, how vast a proportion must. The seed of a thistle supported by its down, the insect by its beak, and the bird by its more able wing, may tempt the dangers of the sea, but of these how many millions must perish for one who arrives at the distance of 1,200 miles from the place of its rest? It appears indeed far more difficult to account for the passage of one individual than to believe the destruction of all that ever may have been by their ill fate hurried into such an attempt. Money of all nations passes here according to its real intrinsic European value. Therefore, there is no kind of trouble on that head, as in all the Dutch settlements. End of section 63. Some account of St. Helena. Section 64 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August, 1768 to 12 July, 1771, by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail, Timmerman, Vaughan. Section 64, June, 1771 and July, 1771. June 1771. 1771 June 1. Trade more moderate and pleasant weather. 1771 June 2. Saw some gulfweed today for the first time. 1771 June 3. This day passed under the sun, and were for the last time askew. Showers and squalls of wind. Saw more gulfweed. 1771 June 4. Gulfweed rather increased. 1771 June 5. Less gulfweed than yesterday, so lest we should leave its station, we began to catch it by means of a pole with 6 large hooks fastened to its end. Out of it we took Celea pelagica, Medusa porpita, Cynathus pelagicus, and Lophius pelagicus, and Cancer minutus. 1771 June 6. More gulfweed, in which took up several individuals of the aforementioned species, besides which were caught Cancer pelagicus and a shrimp not described. Several tropic birds were seen, all of which flew in a straight line toward the coast of Africa. 1771 June 7. Still more gulfweed, in general laying in long lines upon the water, of a very small breadth, but extending in length as far as the eye could reach. More tropic birds were seen, most of which flew as yesterday, and one black shearwater. 1771 June 8. Less gulfweed, 2 tropic birds flying as before. 1771 June 9. Scarce any weed, the water smooth, as if there had been no wind for some time in these latitudes. 1771 June 10. Still light winds and no sea, very little weed. 1771 June 11. Rather more weed than lately. Quite calm, so that I went out in the boat and took many individuals of all the species mentioned before, but nothing new. 1771 June 12. Water as smooth as in a harbour. Were we in an unknown sea, we should build much on the probability of some land in the neighbourhood. Some porpoises and skipjacks were seen, but very little weed. 1771 June 14. Light winds and smooth water. 2 turtle were seen, and a little gulfweed. 1771 June 15. Saw a small sloop, which we soon outsailed and left behind. No weed at all today. 1771 June 16. Spoke an outward-bound Brazilman, and soon left him. 1771 June 17. Saw 2 ships, very far off. 1771 June 18. Saw 3 New England schooners cruising for whales. Sent a boat on board one, who told us that he had yesterday spoke an outward-bound Englishman, who told him that all was peace in Europe, and that the Spaniards had agreed to pay the Manila ransom with interest in 1 year, and $1 million for damages done at the Falkland Islands. The vessel had by their own account been out 5 weeks and caught nothing. They had chased a whale 60 leagues into File Harbour, into which they could not follow it, as the Portuguese suffer no whaler to go into any of their ports in the western islands. They had, they said, no meat on board, but lived upon what they could catch. They sold us readily 4 large albacores, saying that they could catch more. As for American news, King George, they said, had behaved very ill for some time, but they had brought him to terms at last. 1771 June 20. Saw a large ship ahead of us, which on lowering our foretopsail hoisted a flag at her main topsail head. She soon, however, made sail and left us. 1771 June 21. About noon we discovered a fleet of 13 sail of large ships on our weather quarter. These we doubted not were our consorts, the India fleet. 1 shearwater was seen. 1771 June 22. The fleet held so much better a wind than us that they fairly went out of sight to the windward of us, who indeed had split both our topgallant sails in a squall. 1771 June 23. Wind very foul. Saw 1 shearwater. The reason of so few having been seen this passage may be that during their breeding time they do not wander far out at sea. 1771 June 30. Both yesterday and today a few shearwaters were seen. In the night many were about the ship crying very much. July 1771. 1771 July 1. My bitch lady was found dead in my cabin, laying upon a stool on which she generally slept. She had been remarkably well for some days. In the night she shrieked out very loud, so that we who slept in the great cabin heard her, but becoming quiet immediately, no one regarded it. Whatever disease was the cause of her death, it was the most sudden that ever came under my observation. Many shearwaters were about the ship. 1771 July 5. In the night the ship passed through a shoal of mackerels, and in the morning many crabs, and some seaweed was observed, with many shearwaters. 1771 July 6. Several shearwaters and 1 gannet were seen. Much seaweed, like tape, flattish and narrow. 1771 July 7. Several shearwaters and much tapeweed. The water a little discoloured. Caught lepus signifera floating upon the water, and round congeries, some of which were large enough to fill a man's hat. 1771 July 8. Calm. Went in boat and shot fulmar and Manx puffin of Pennant's British Zoology. Much seaweed, but no leopardies. 1771 July 10. This morning the land was discovered by young Nick, the same boy who first saw New Zealand. It proved to be the lizard. 1771 July 12. At 3 o'clock landed at Deal. End of section 64. End of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks.